All right. Well, part one got a little bit contentious there, and I apologize for that. By the way, did you catch the error? The humanities has been watered down. I haven't done these videos in a long time, but I thought that was rather humorous. Mathematics has also been watered down, and that's as certain as 2 plus 2 equals 5. Ha ha. Okay. A little joke at my expense. That's fine. We'll keep it light. Mr. Molyneux or Dr. Molyneux, again, I let that go a little bit too farther. I'm going to try to keep this on the realm of ideas. I'd like to talk about your use of the label of anarchism. I think there's an historical problem with it, and I think that there's a philosophical problem with it. I do not class myself as an anarchist in particular because, and I'm talking about a left-wing anarchist, I do not classify myself as a left-wing anarchist because I do not believe in revolutionary violence. I'm a pacifist. I do, however, consider myself a libertarian of the left, and I do feel that the purity of the label is something that the left-wing anarchists should retain. And so my agreement or disagreement with anarchism would be an agreement or a disagreement with them, and I'd like to state why. I also want to say that from within your own philosophy there would be a problem with calling yourself, with equating yourself with the traditional left-wing anarchists. And I want to make a claim as to why the forefathers and mothers of mothers and fathers, whatever the case may be, of anarcho-capitalism probably would disclaim any actual connection with left-wing anarchism. So it's very, very hard. Also, the sound on this might be a little bit low, so I apologize. Let me begin. Traditional left-wing anarchism, or the anarchist label, emerged out of the broad working class movement against the domination of the new capitalists that seized power in America and Europe after the American and French revolutions. Those revolutions had a radical element to them. Certainly the French did. But when the bourgeoisie, when the new capitalist class came and seized power, they essentially told the more radical elements within the workers to get lost. Well, the workers did not get lost. The workers formed movements for change, movements for justice, a lot of which were reformist. In other words, they wanted to retain the capitalist structure, but a number of them were radical, and the radical ones became your socialists and your anarchists. And by anarchists, again, I'm referring to the anarchism of Bakunin, the anarchism eventually of Kropotkin, and then today would be represented by Noam Chomsky. This anarchism presupposed the idea of the overthrow of capitalism, including the machinery of the state, which was seen as an instrument of the capitalist class, and the implementation of an egalitarian and communal social order. Anarchism was a goal shared by the socialists also, particularly by Marx. He saw the withering away of the state as the ultimate goal. He differed from the anarchists in the sense that he believed that a worker state would happen before the withering away of the state, but he did not disagree with them in terms of his ultimate idea of his goal for society, which would have been the end of capitalism, the end of religion, and yes, the end of the state at the very same time. The same as that of the classical anarchists. Anarchism means against the rulers. It is not simply against the government as an infringement of individual liberty. That was an idea that would have gone very well with the bourgeois philosophies of the late 18th century and the Enlightenment. The more radical concept would have been the overthrow of systems of hierarchy and domination in the name of a collective. Now, this is the key thing. In the name of a collective group, i.e. the people, i.e. the working class, or what have you. Now, again, I am not a revolutionary because I do not believe in apocalyptic eschatology being secularized and brought into the political realm. So I'm going to go into my own views on economics in part 3. I do, however, believe that if we're going to use a label and if we're going to assume the label, then one respects the history of the label. If I were to call myself a right-wing Republican, but then go and advocate free pot and, the overthrow of the military or something like that, I would not be doing justice to the right-wing Republican label. If I were to call myself an FDR Democrat and then say that all business should be deregulated, I would not be fair to the FDR Democrat tradition. And so if Mr. Molyneux or Dr. Molyneux is going to call himself an anarchist, then the actual history of the label would be that he's labeling himself after a group of people who are, quote, against the rulers in the name of a collective. Now, the so-called anarcho-capitalists, or really more radical libertarian individualists, they do not speak in the name of a collective. In fact, in the name of Hans Hermann Hoppe, he is so far into the libertarian individualism aspect of it that he prefers monarchy to democracy, because presumably it's more capitalist than a pure form of democracy. And this, by the way, is the opposite of the traditional anarchist perspective, which very much allied itself with the democratic revolutions of 1848 and so forth. So, but on a more philosophical level, and actually before I get to the more philosophical level, there's an additional point, is that I believe that if the anarchist capitalists, so-called, were given the choice between a kind of Lazarus long existence side by side the state, but with the state still standing, versus an overthrow of the state in the name of a collective, they would choose the former. I think they'd be very honest about that. I think that is they don't claim to speak in the name of a collective. They are individualists. Their notion of liberty is a negative libertarianism, and I don't mean by negative some horrible thing. It just means against domination by coercion, which, by the way, is honorable. I think that that is an honorable aspect of what freedom means, although I don't think it's complete. And so I'm starting to lose focus here, I'm sorry. But in a more broad sense, there is a sense, though, in which you personally, Mr. Molyneux, even by anarcho-capitalist standards, even by the kind of 19th century classical liberal individualist standards, would differ. In the actual movements against police brutality, it seems like Mr. Molyneux or Dr. Molyneux seems to disparage. He seems to not, when African Americans complain about the police, he seems to be rather hostile. When movements rise up like Occupy Wall Street, which are not only rising up against capitalist forms of oppression, but also the police state, the very thing that libertarians would also ideally oppose, Mr. Molyneux seems rather hostile to that. And so there comes a question: is Stefan Molyneux only opposing the democratic functions of government? Is he only opposing government to the extent to which oftentimes government is a stand-in for the popular will? And so if he's going to do this, then I think calling himself an anarchist, really more what he should call himself is somebody who's a radical libertarian individualist to such an extreme that he's willing to be free in his own sphere alongside other people being under structures of domination. And this is something very, very different than what traditional anarchism presupposed. Yes, there's an individualist wing of anarchism, and I understand that. I'm not saying that there are not forms of anarchism that you could reach back into antiquity and say this supports the individualist idea, but none of them would be on the side of police violence. One person who comes to mind is Henry David Thoreau, definitely an individualist anarchist, but also somebody who defended John Brown and defended radical abolitionism. So, as I say, I'm not a left-wing anarchist. I'm going to get, in part 3, I'm going to get into my own notions of economics. In part 1, I talked about STEM versus non-STEM. In part 2, I've talked about anarchism. In part 3, I'm going to talk about Tesla economics. So, stay tuned.